Welcome as we look at the Gospel of John with eyes for Generation Z. My name is Tanita Maddox, and we're going to read through the Gospel of John, keeping in mind 6 key questions that Generation Z is asking based on their values and worldview, and 2 key questions they're asking about God. The goal of this project is to uncover and share a relevant Bible reading and gospel to Generation Z. We're going to jump into John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11, the woman caught in adultery. Questions we're going to focus in on are, am I safe? And do all people matter to God? A third question we will touch on lightly is also, will you accept me? I've commonly used this passage in the past to talk about what sin is, as well as how does Jesus interact or feel about sin. Some very common ways to talk about what sin is and how it impacts us in the past has been in moral terms, meaning I'm falling short of God's standard or that we're lawbreakers, but there's a moral component of guilt. One of the reasons I've used this passage to talk about sin is it because it shows kind of equality of guilt of all people. We have the Pharisees who are trying to do the right thing, trying to follow God's law, who fall short, as well as a woman who has rejected it on some level and also falls short. Talking about sin in this way of equal guilt assumes that there is some kind of shared moral standard. Talking about sin in moral terms may be difficult for a generation that does not believe in a standard morality. For a Gen Z audience, morality is individualistic. It's individually determined. So you hear things like, that's my truth, that's your truth, as well as you can't tell me what to do, because my morality is judged by me. In our current cultural moment, there's always a workaround to guilt. There's always a way I can explain why I did what I did, why it's not wrong. However, this passage is helpful to talk about sin because sin is a core part of the conversation within it. We just have to pay attention to the language of how we're talking about sin with our Gen Z friends. Now we have the setting of Jesus at the temple and the teachers of the law bringing a woman caught in adultery, and they made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" In other words, the law of Moses that is coming from God says that this act is worthy of execution. What do you say? There are a number of things we can unpack with this woman's experience in this passage. We are witnessing systemic sin and the impact of sexism and treating this woman as lower, below, second class. One of the indicators of systemic sin is the fact that she is brought before the group at the temple, but the man she was committing adultery with was not. Now, this can be an entry point into engaging the values of our Gen Z audience and what's happening in the world as a result of sin. They value acceptance. What we're seeing is rejection. If we value safety, in this space, this woman is unsafe. If we value justice, we see a moment that seems very unfair. When we list out those things, rejection, unsafe, intolerance, unjust, and we look at these things in the world and we think, God must be bad because this is the world I see. The answer we can give to our Gen Z friends is that these things don't exist because of God. They exist because of something called sin. It'd be difficult to slip by this passage without addressing that is the book of the law, the book of Moses, so God's law, that prescribes execution for this act. Jesus summarizes the law in 2 sentences, right? Love the Lord God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the backdrop of the law. The folks in this group who are asking for execution can be misinterpreting God by the circumstances the same the way that we do. We miss the point of what God was trying to say. Another perspective to unpack this with our Gen Z friends is this group of people is looking for justice. Whatever their cultural context is, whatever their values are, there is something that has been broken that calls for justice. It can be difficult to relate with a different culture and a different set of values. Is there anything that you've seen in your life where you look and you've cried out for justice and we demand for things to be set right? It may not necessarily be a death penalty, but are there places that get us so angry and so stirred up that we demand for justice because what we see is broken? It could be the same place as this group. They saw injustice and wanted it righted. I think we can relate with watching someone break a value that is so nearly and dearly held to us, that we demand for justice to take place. We pick up in verse 6 where Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger, and they kept on questioning him. He straightened up and said to them, "If any of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." So there you go. We have the word sin that has popped up. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until Jesus was left with the woman. Here we can engage that question, am I safe? Now, this woman enters into a space that clearly is not safe, right? There's a group of people demanding for her execution. And Jesus stands between her and them in order to provide a safe place. Jesus stands between her and the consequences of the decision she's made. Jesus stands between her and the consequences of her sin. In other words, in Jesus, sin does not have the final say. At the same time, for those who wanted justice, are they safe? What he does is simply ask a question. If you're without sin, you be the first one to throw the stone. Jesus did not ask them to leave. Jesus allows a space for them to kind of reflect on themselves. They left. This lightly brushes over the question, will you accept me? Maybe they answered for themselves. There's no way that God could accept me in my sin. One thing I would point out to my audience is that for those who want justice, grace is a failure. And for those who want grace, justice is intolerant and cruel. God did not act the way they wanted God to act. Jesus did not act the way they wanted Jesus to act. He didn't fit their picture. How many of us can relate with that? So now we have Jesus left with the woman, and he says, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one," she said. "Neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Now go and leave your life of sin." We see the word sin again. So what is Jesus saying? How can we contextualize this sentence? Go now and leave your life of sin. The way I would like to describe it is to say, please come home. Turn your back on sin. Come home to God and put God back in his rightful place. Because only in that will you ever know true acceptance, true safety, and justice and grace together. And Jesus is offering forgiveness. There is an opportunity for her to respond to that request, respond to the invitation to come home. And in that, she will experience the forgiveness that he is offering to her. In the question, do all people matter to God? We see God in the form of Jesus interacting with male and female, as well as power structures and morality structures. What we do see is that he definitely cares about the marginalized. He cares about the woman. He also cares about those in power and allows them space to determine for themselves how they stood up in their own ideas of justice. So if I were to use this passage to talk about sin, there's a few things I would say. If you're looking for a way to define sin and relate to this passage, it really does a good job of relating to the actual translation of missing the mark. The group missed the mark when it came to understanding what it meant to follow God. They're living in their own sense of what we think. We think this is the right way, and living in that. They miss the mark in understanding who God is, how he works, and how we're supposed to follow him. It's typical for us to look at our circumstances of the world and say God is a bad God. The reason we see these things in the world, rejection, unsafety, injustice, intolerance, is because of the existence of sin. This resonates with the values and worldview of our Gen Z audience. They can see that something is wrong with the world, and we get to agree with them and say, yes, these things are wrong. They're problematic and they're hurtful. But that's not because of God. It's because of this thing called sin. The woman also misses the mark in her decision to have a sexual relationship with someone who's not her husband or someone who is somebody else's husband. This woman is a victim of systemic sin. She is also a personal perpetrator of sin. And if she was not, Jesus would not have asked her to leave her life of sin. But he recognizes systemic sin and deals with that. And then he also deals with the personal sin. But if we are free to look for life, identity, meaning, purpose, acceptance, safety, justice, if we're free to look for that wherever we want to, and we look for that outside of God, that is missing the mark. We'll never hit the mark. It will always feel off-center. It will always feel like we're chasing something we cannot hit. And that's what sin is. It is missing the mark. I do still think it's difficult to use this passage in terms of talking about personal ownership or guilt, because you can run into this idea that there is no moral compass or agreed upon moral guide for the audience to lean into.